The Attentive Church Leadership Podcast from Leighton Ford Ministries. Several years ago, I read a great quote from a leadership guru named Bill Fields. Bill said that when the rate of external change exceeds the rate of internal change, disaster is imminent. When the rate of external change, what's happening in the world around us, exceeds the rate of internal change, the things that are happening inside our organizations, disaster is imminent. Who was Bill Fields, by the way? Well, among many other things in his life, he was the long-term CEO of Blockbuster Entertainment. When's the last time you visited a Blockbuster to rent a movie? The rate of external change exceeded the rate of internal change. Welcome to our podcast for Attentive Church Leadership. I'm Kevin Ford. Today we're going to hear from Jim Singleton, who is my co-author, dear friend and colleague at Leighton Ford Ministries. Jim has been the pastor of several large churches around the United States. He's been on church staffs. He's been a seminary professor. He's an historian. He's a theologian. He's just a wonderful guy. And he actually used to play baseball, believe it or not. He's a great athlete. Jim and Sarah, his wife, live in the Pacific Northwest, and Jim's become a dear friend across the years. I first met Jim when I was consulting with the church he pastored in Colorado Springs. One of the issues that they were facing is the church leadership said that they were change averse, that historically they had been a church that resisted change. Well, as we walked through a process together, I realized this was not true. The church historically had been on the cutting edge of many things, but we had to go back sometimes decades to find the things the church had been willing to change. Well, today Jim shares with us from the first chapter of our book, Joshua chapter 3, as the Israelites are attempting to cross the Jordan River, they come to a place they'd never been before. So let's hear what Jim has to say and think about the places that you've never been before in your own church as you listen to Jim today. May God bless you richly.
Hello, this is Rhett Wilson, and I want to welcome you again to the Attentive Church Leadership Podcast. I am a pastor, and I also serve as the Senior Communications Director for Leighton Ford Ministries, and we're so glad that you have joined us. And today, our special guest is Jim Singleton. Jim and Kevin Ford have recently written this new book from University Press. Jim has been a longtime Presbyterian pastor. He was also a professor of pastoral leadership and evangelism at Conwell Theological Seminary. Currently, Jim serves as the executive director of North American Mentoring Services for Leighton Ford Ministries. And he is very involved in mentoring pastors and helping churches. He actually teaches at the Institute of Theology for ECO, the Covenant Order of Presbyterians. And Jim brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. And Jim, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Rhett. Great to be with you.
And now, interestingly, Jim and I have discovered that we have a commonality. The Lord used a certain book years ago in both our lives to kind of hook both of us with a passion for disciple making. When I was a freshman in college in 1991, someone at our school led a small group of us through Leroy Imes's book, The Lost Art of Disciple Making. And that was really a key time in my life when God was showing me the value of one-on-one and small group disciple making. And Jim, you and I discovered that God used the same resource in your life. Why don't you tell us about that for a minute?
I just glanced to see if it was on my shelf right here, but yes, in about 1983, I came across the book. I read it. I thought, wow, this is remarkable, and I need to get on this. So I started discipling people really that same period of time in the early 80s and have been ever since. As a rather busy pastor and busy graduate student, I just kept discipling people by this book by Leroy Imes. And then Rhett and I discovered that The person that had discipled me was 2 steps away from a man named Gene War in Oklahoma City. And Gene War was a navigator person, disciple maker. He discipled with a guy named Jack Huff, who discipled Mike Fisher, who discipled me. And Rhett has some of that same history.
That's right. A man who mentored me in college, his name was Morris Moose Keller. And Moose had been in the Oklahoma City Men's Bible Study under Gene Ward. And Gene had discipled Moose. And so Jim and I just met a few years ago, and we discovered that connection of spiritual disciple making going back to those men in that time in Oklahoma City.
We're spiritual
Jim,
cousins, Rhett.
That's right. Spiritual brothers and cousins, right? That's right. Well, today we are really bouncing off of the first chapter of the book. How did we get to a world we've never known? And the first chapter of the book is really about change, and it's really about transition. And Jim, you and Kevin do a great job in that first chapter talking about how much the North American culture has changed in your lifetime and in the lifetime of maybe your parents and grandparents. You actually begin with an amazing story from New York City about a Sunday school parade. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sometimes it's just hard for us to realize how much has changed in a relatively quick period of time. So on June the 6th, 1946, in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York, there was a parade on a Thursday. Now you have to understand New York City schools typically go until the middle of June. So this is June 6th. And there's a parade. 90,000 children are let out of school on a Thursday to go to a parade in a park. And you go, well, why would they be going to a parade in a park on a Thursday on a school day? And it was literally 2 years to the day to the landing at Normandy, but the parade had nothing to do with D-Day. On the reviewing stand, if you can imagine this, was not only the governor of Brooklyn, the mayor of Brooklyn, the governor of New York, and a United States Supreme Court justice, one of the 9. And they were there on this reviewing stand with all these children in starched pinafores and bow ties and hard shoes. And why? Well, it was the 117th annual Sunday school parade. A Sunday school parade letting children out. And that wasn't a rare experience. It was simply the 117th annual, and it continued on until the 70s. It eventually had to move from Thursday to Saturday. And of course, that got in the way of lots of things. But it's just hard for us to picture a world in which a school system in New York, of all places, would let children out for a Sunday school parade. And I bet if we ran a Sunday school parade for all the children in the state of New York right now, we would not have 5,000 children at a parade. So It just shows, our world is changing.
That is amazing. Very significantly changed. And like you said, in really just a relatively short amount of time, just a few decades, we have gone through a major transition. Yeah. You all also talk about the transition from the broadcast era to the digital era. Tell us a little bit about that as it relates to the church.
Well, in some respects, the church has been slow to technology. In the 50s, when the broadcast era of television emerges, and of course, technically the broadcast era began at radio, and I would say there have been many Christians using radio. We didn't embrace TV in the same way because it was so expensive. Probably Billy Graham was the largest user of TV. There was a Catholic named Fulton Sheen who did. There was certainly the Hour of Power that was part of TV, but limited use there. We left that to entertainment mostly and news, and we kept doing what we were doing in a local church. When the internet era came along, churches were again very slow to begin to participate on that. I happened to show up at a church in 2005 in Colorado Springs, which was live streaming its Sunday service, mostly because, interestingly, we lived in a military town. We had a large Fort Carson there. We had the Air Force Academy there and a couple of Air Force bases. And so lots of people in the church were being deployed. And so we decided before I got there that they wanted to start broadcasting on the internet so that service people abroad on a Sunday evening could watch what we were doing on Sunday morning. It created quite an interesting thing because lots of the wives of these servicemen, and they were mostly men in that moment, would come down to the front of the church and wave at their husbands and then go sit in their seat before the service started or after it. But that meant that church was ready when COVID hit, and they had a long history of live streaming. My wife, conversely, was pastoring a church that was established in the 1740s, built in the 1750s, had no internet connection at all. And so when COVID hit, we're getting, worship over an iPhone for a little while, trying to send that out to people and on a Facebook. And so you realize that the internet has lots of information on it. It has not been a primary conveyor of spiritual information, though there is much there, it's just lost in the vast sea. So when culture changes the way it communicates, part of what we who are Christians have found is it feels like we are in a world we have never been in before. And again, there's so many resources there that are useful now, but does the culture go there first to find Jesus? Probably not.
And so now, particularly since COVID, pastors and churches, as you all say, are really in a world we've never been in before. And many of us, maybe somewhat jokingly, can say, nothing has prepared us for this. We feel like that this is all brand new in some ways. Now, you kind of anchor the first chapter with the story from Joshua, chapter 3 and 4, which is one of my favorite Old Testament narratives, about the crossing of the Jordan River. And you talk about how they come to this incredible obstacle, and they've got this formidable challenge, and they desperately need the presence of the Lord. And you quote the scripture there when it tells them to follow the ark because they've never been this way before. And there are so many practical biblical lessons in that Joshua 3 and 4 narrative. So let me just ask a few things related to that. We're talking about times of transition, and when Joshua and the Israelites, they were leaving the wilderness, they were about to go in the promised land, so they were smack dab in the middle of transition. Moses had died, he'd led them for 40 years. Here they're transitioning to a new leader. So Jim, think about your own life. Different maybe churches you've served. I know you made the transition into ministry and into pastoral ministry. Then years later, you made a transition into being a seminary professor. And then just recently, you made another significant transition from the seminary into retirement, which just meant you were busy doing other things now. So as you look back over seasons of your life, how would you say you've experienced God's presence amid different times of transition?
It's a great question, Rhett. And transitional periods are quite disturbing in some ways. They can be anxiety producing if we are prone to anxiety. And typically they will threaten our sense of competence because I may know of where I've been before and what I was doing, and suddenly I'm in another thing. And so following the ark is the Old Testament phrase where they believed the presence of God was with them in that ark. For us today, that's follow the Holy Spirit. In Galatians, it urges us, if we say we live by the Spirit, then keep in step with the Spirit. And so that whole phrase is urging us to be spirit dependent. But as I've made shifts, I can look back and realize how very afraid I was. And that's why in the first chapter of Joshua, before we even start crossing the river, at the notice that Moses has died, and now Joshua's going to lead, in the first 9 verses, 3 times God has to tell him to be strong and courageous, strong and very courageous, reminding him that I'm going to be with you. Well, you wouldn't have to tell somebody to be strong and courageous if they didn't feel weak and afraid. So I can look back, and I tried to bluff my way into thinking I was strong and courageous. But when I first became an associate pastor in a large church in San Antonio, Texas, I was desperately afraid I was going to fail. I was not going to make it as a pastor. When I left that church 5 years later to go back to academia to get another degree, I had no business getting a doctoral degree. I had no professors tell me, you're the doctoral type, but I felt like I needed to get this to be equipped to do something I was going to do later. But it was intimidating to go into that transition. Felt like there were giants in the land, and I didn't know how to navigate it. And then when I went to be a senior pastor after that for the first time in Spokane, Washington, where I am again, I was pastoring a church with 2 associates, and I was young and I was dumb, and yet I thought I knew how to do it, but I really didn't know how to do it, so I had to fake it. And you get into all kinds of troubles when you're trying to fake it till you make it, because I didn't quite know how to access being strong and courageous. Eventually, I went to another church in Austin, which had its own challenges, and then a church in Colorado Springs, which was far larger than anything I had managed before. Had 100 people on staff. What did I know about that? But again, I kind of had to act like I was courageous, but inside I thought, oh, they're going to find out any minute what an imposter I am. And so all of those moments of what I would call natural transition that happen in a pastor's life are just exacerbated by the external things. Because it felt like in 1983, as I started ministry, that ministry was not that dramatically different than it had been in my father's generation in the 50s. But by the time I got into the next century and the next millennium, it just started feeling day after day, it feels like this is different. The culture was less appreciative of the faith. There were no Sunday school parades on June the 6th. There were no external supports in a place like Colorado Springs for the establishment of faith. When I moved back to Massachusetts to start teaching, which was its own challenge of competence, my wife was pastoring a church, and high school graduation, Rhett, happened at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning in that community. High school graduation, 10 o'clock Sunday morning.
Wow.
Not to mention all of the soccer games and all of the baseball games and all of the other competing forces. So no dedicated time by the culture for worship. And of course, when you begin to get in an internet era, you can't even use illustrations as easily as you used to, because you find out that some website had decided that story didn't really happen. And so oh my goodness, I've got to check sources in a different way to do the things I'm doing. And so it just feels like where I have lived in Massachusetts and the state of Washington and Colorado in particular, these are places that are not necessarily hostile to the gospel, but certainly not supportive. And it's seen as a sideline. And again, that's just not unusual in a missions context. You expect that if you're going to take the gospel to India. You just didn't somehow expect that in the home of New England Puritanism, which is now far from that. So that's part of why many who are pastors are just not sure what to do with the change. The diminishment of the trust in a pastor is far different than it was. We used to be pretty high up on the list of trusted occupations. Now we're down there next to used car salesmen on the list. So it's really been changed. So I don't normally like to admit on an airplane when I'm sitting next to somebody that I'm a pastor, because that immediately they're going to just shut that off. If I say I work with people, they want to have a conversation, and we might get there, but it's different, Rhett. And so helping pastors adjust to the difference is the first part of that book.
So, Chuck Swindoll, who was at one time a seminary professor, I heard him make the statement one time that seminary can be the darkest place on the face of the globe, because he said people that are studying about God can not themselves necessarily be close to God. And so when I think about the change and the pressures and the stress, and so many times when God really calls us to something, he calls us to something that is beyond what we can do. It's bigger than we can do on our own. Really, at a fundamental level, how do pastors stay behind that ark? How do we stay connected to that presence so all the overwhelming changes don't just topple us?
Yeah. Well, number one, we have to acknowledge there is an ark. There is a Holy Spirit. There is a presence of God. And I think we all have to cultivate that connective tissue. So that leads us back to our original statement about the lost art of disciple making. As I got to the seminary, most of the students I was working with had never been discipled in an intentional one-on-one or micro group style by anyone in their life, and certainly not by a pastor. So there was some deficiency in what they were coming to seminary with spiritually, and thus in an academic setting trying to get a master's degree, it was not necessarily supportive of that spiritual life. Now, we had to make some changes and make some avenues so that at a seminary it was. And that's a big issue, but it's not the first language of an academic institution to be there to support your spiritual life. So yes, when you look at where many people left behind their spiritual practices, who are people who are pastors, the place that started getting left behind was the seminary. They started substituting exegesis for a devotional time with Jesus. And when that happens and they go back out into the church, they don't re-engage at a devotional level. They're doing sermon prep.
And if we're not careful, we can become like Samson, when it says that the Lord had left him and he wasn't even aware of it. Not meaning that we lose our salvation, but we can lose that dynamic touch and power and presence of the Lord on our lives.
That's right.
Jim, what obstacles do you see the church in North America currently facing, and maybe some that we have never really faced before?
Well, I think, for 3 generations now, I have seen a struggle in the church's mind to reach the next generation. So I am classically known as a baby boomer. I was born between 46 and 64. And much of the attractional church model was an endeavor to get baby boomers from, the Jesus Revolution era back to church. And the change was not dramatic because we grew up singing Holy, 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 and we liked to sing some other songs like Seek Ye First, but it wasn't dramatically different. When you start getting to the next generational cohorts, what we have called Gen X and Millennials and Gen Z, the dramatic change gets accelerated with each generation. And the loss of trust in religious institutions increases with each generation, the loss of trust in pastors. So I think one of the incredible moments we're facing is the rise of the nones, those who have no religious faith. And again, they're highly focused on millennials and Gen Z. Now, they're not the most contented people in this world. They have high anxiety, high frustrations, but they also, with some exceptions, are not clustered around congregations. So Whereas we've been able to wait for them to come. I often say we have appropriated the Little Bo Peep model of evangelism, which is Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and doesn't know where to find them. What's the strategy? Leave them alone. They'll come home, wagging their tails behind them. We've been waiting a long time for them to come home. If you keep reading Little Bo Peep, by the 3rd verse, it says, then up she took her little crook, determined for to find them. She found them indeed, but it made her heart bleed, for that all left their tails behind them, which means they were all wounded. I think we've got to get to verse 3. And that means we've got to build relationships with generations we don't understand for the sake of a gospel we do understand. And this is not that much different than what every missionary has to do when they encounter another culture, because it's like another culture. It's like we're speaking almost another language with another value system. And that did not deter missionaries from trying, but sometimes we get intimidated at ages like you and I have. You're much younger than I am, Rhett, but still, we get intimidated. Can we talk to those dear folks? Yes, we can. And yes, they're hungry for Jesus.
And so sometimes it's easy for pastors and churches in our culture to wrongly think that we are on home territory here. And we need to embrace a different mindset that says, no, we're actually missionaries on a foreign land. We're on missionary soil. And missionaries don't exactly expect the culture to understand the Christian language and the gospel.
They don't. So they translate.
Yeah.
They translate, and they've learned to help people understand it in a new and fresh way. So that's part of the church's task. But,
Jim,
but if we don't do discipleship, Brad, then we go out and have nothing to say. Somebody once made a joke about my little Presbyterian tribe and said, what do you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness and a Presbyterian? You get somebody who will knock on a door with nothing to say.
Wow.
And I don't want to be that person either.
Yeah. Well, Jim, you've had a lot of experience with a number of different churches, some that you've led and some that you have helped and consulted. As churches face times of transition, both internally, but also just in the culture that we are living in. Even, I'm in rural South Carolina, and in rural South Carolina now, there's really not a respect for the Sunday morning time. The soccer games, the baseball games, they're scheduled on Sunday mornings now. As churches face internal and external transition, how have you experienced or seen churches embrace the transition or resist the transition?
Well, I think in some ways, Rhett, the dynamic is somewhat summarized by a man named Leslie Newbegin, who said, when you go into a missionary context, you either stay real close to the sending culture and assume the receptor culture is going to embrace you. So, for instance, when the Scottish took the gospel to Kenya, they basically made the Kenyans learn English. They made them learn how to pour tea correctly, and they made them sit still in worship with no drums. So you become like us. And many North American churches have basically said that to younger cultures. If you'll just, as soon as you learn to love the things we love, then you're going to love this church. On the contrary, other side of the pole, Newbegin says you can actually become too close to the receiving culture. And that creates what is typically known as syncretism, which is the mixing of beliefs together. And that is that we'll become like them. And if they're worshiping ancestors in the tree, then we'll just tell them those are the various saints, and we can, give them a different name, but you can keep doing what you've been doing. So these two poles, kind of isolation in our culture or accommodation in their culture, are the two poles that we want to find a spot right in the middle of, where we are neither rejecting your culture or making you embrace ours entirely. We're trying to discover how is God working in this particular moment with our particular people? And that's actually a lot of work, Rhett. It's easier to do either pole than to find that dynamic middle place in between. But that's what Newbegin was urging his church to do when he retired from India, moved back to England, and discovered that the place he had landed was now a secular culture. How are we going to reach it for Christ? And so that's the hard work that some of the rest of the book is trying to help us do, to find this sense of what is our purpose, what is at the core of our being, what is the strategy for reaching people. And so as we walk people through the rest of the book, that's what we're hoping they will discover.
You know, I can remember when I was a boy growing up in our Baptist church, some people didn't like young people to wear blue jeans on Sunday nights. That was considered irreverent. We'd be happy if they came in with blue jeans. We would just be happy that they were there, right?
Yeah.
You had an experience in one of your churches related to whether or not we could bring coffee into the sanctuary. And I think that relates to that a little bit. Tell us just briefly about that story.
Yeah, it was some dear ushers who came and asked me, what do I want to do with the smugglers that are in church? And I just thought, smugglers? That just sounds horrible. What are they smuggling? And he said, well, they're smuggling in coffee from Starbucks because we had a Starbucks 1 block away. And because it's cold culture in Colorado, they were putting it underneath their coats and sneaking into the sanctuary. But then the ushers were discovering the cups under the pew after the service. What do you want us to do about that? And of course, there is a sign in nearly every Presbyterian church on the outside of the sanctuary that says no food or drink in the sanctuary. So we were transgressing the sign. Now, when I ask my ushers, where does that sign come from? Well, I think it's in the book of Leviticus, or maybe it's in the book of Deuteronomy or somewhere. I go, well, actually, it's not. In fact, coffee is not even mentioned in Scripture. So it took a process of discovery. Why are we offended with coffee in the sanctuary? And why are others so naturally welcoming it? And again, it did not create a crisis till coffee got expensive. Because if you just got a cup of church coffee, which was usually Folgers on sale, it wasn't that good anyway. And if the usher said put it down, well, you weren't missing much. But if you had just paid $6 for the cup of coffee, then you don't really want to put it down. So you bring it in, and the young adults begin to express that having coffee in the sanctuary felt hospitable. It felt like a community. It felt like we were there together having a conversation with God about things that were important. To another generation, that was seen as irreverent, that we were transgressing that same instinct that didn't want you to wear blue jeans, and that to be in the house of God, you had to put on your Sunday best and behave. And, you know, sometimes my elders would catastrophize things, and one of them said, well, we're just a block from Borealis Pizza as well. I just hate it when somebody comes in and says, who wanted the pepperoni? We can't have that. And then another elder said, I refuse to smell French fries in the sanctuary. And I went, wait a minute, we're talking about coffee. We're only having coffee here. But that's the way change has to be addressed. And it took us several months to look at those two competing values and to help us come to a conclusion.
So lots of challenges to discover what are we supposed to hold on to and not change, and what is really just a matter of culture and not Bible and not gospel. Right. And that's hard for us many times. In the story in Joshua, God required the priests to step into the river before he stopped the water. So he required an act of faith, or he required movement on their part before they saw God get involved. And I'm just curious in your own life, your own experiences with the Lord, your own transitions. What's a time when God required you to move and act before you saw him get involved? Maybe it was right through your own impossibility.
I would say almost every time God has called me into a new place, a new calling, I didn't feel prepared for a single one of them. And it felt like there was a roaring river flowing by and I was being asked to step in it. And I couldn't imagine how we're going to do this. I knew God would be with me in my head. The message had not gotten to my emotions at the same level. And so it always took an act of faith. I mean, getting married took one of those acts of faith. Adopting a child took one of those acts of faith. So I think there are many moments in life where we don't see how this is going to work, but we've got to take a step because he's calling us to take that step.
Reminds me that Henry Blackaby said one time that God always calls us one step beyond where we've been before.
Right.
And our naturalness wants to stay where we feel like we can control it.
That's right.
And he has a way of forcing us to trust him, doesn't he?
That's right. That's right.
Jim, before we go, near the very beginning of the chapter, you share a wonderful testimony from your seminary days when you and your wife faced a financial crisis and a way that God really intervened dramatically. For anyone who hasn't already read that story, why don't you just briefly share that with us?
Okay. Well, that was a moment where seminary was ending. There was frankly a part of me that was insecure about, wow, I've just got one last semester and then I'm supposed to be ready to go do this. And I was fairly nervous. In the midst of that, my wife had a medical situation of what's called an ectopic pregnancy. She had to go to the hospital in the middle of the night. She had to have emergency surgery abdominally, and the doctor came out and said, we've got this under control, but she is not going to be able to work. She was a nurse and not going to be able to work turning people over and all that kind of thing for about 3 months. And I thought, wait a minute, she is the breadwinner of this family while I'm in school. This is not going to work. And so I began thinking, okay, I think this is my sign that I'm not supposed to be a pastor. And that's okay. I'll go out and do something else. I've wasted 2.5 years trying to get ready for this, but I kind of had that hunch myself that I'm not ready, I'm not equipped, I'm not enough. So I'll go back to doing what I had been doing, which was being a social worker. And I went to the mailbox the next day, and in the mailbox was a letter from my childhood best friend from Oklahoma City. And he was not a letter writer, so I was surprised to see a letter from him. We hadn't talked in probably a year at that point. And I had sat down the night before and figured out what it was going to cost us to get to the end of 5 more months. And in that day, under those financial circumstances, it was going to be $2,223. I'd measured it out to the penny. That's the gap of what it was that I was not earning in a little church that was going to be the gap for us to make it. And I thought, I don't know how we're going to make that. I don't have anybody I can call. And when I opened the letter, there was a check from Dale Boaz to us for $2,223. And I thought, how did he know? I only compiled the list last night. And then I looked, the check was written 2 days before Sarah had her ectopic pregnancy. So I thought, now I'm really puzzled. How on earth could he have known that? And so I called him up and I said, Dale, I got your check. I'm so thankful. It's kind of a weird amount. Can you tell me how you came to this weird amount? And he said, well, it's real simple. I had a car I wanted to sell. I had a sign for sale in it for months. Nobody would buy it. On New Year's Eve, icy streets, a drunk driver hit that icy streets and totaled my car. And when the insurance company, I prayed to God, I said, God, if you will help me sell my car, I'll give 1/3 away to some kind of missions. And nothing happened. And when I got the check from the insurance company, it was for $6,669. And I'd promised God 1/3. So I divided that out, and that was 2,223. Okay, I'm going to send that. Where do I send it, God? And God said, send it to Jimmy Singleton. I said, Dale, I just did a list last night because Sarah had this surgery. And this is what it was going to take us to get to the end of the year. And it's the exact amount.
That's
And
marvelous.
that was that thing that allowed me then to step in the river.
Mm.
Because it gave me confidence that maybe God does want me to go do this.
Maybe so. That's the marvelous providence of God, his provision. He saw ahead and he stepped in. And I expect 40 years later or so, you still don't feel prepared, right?
Right.
Still
now
having
doing things like this, Rhett. This is not my natural habitat, but here we are.
That's right. Still trusting God. Well, so Jim, this chapter kind of sets up the rest of the book as we talk about transition. So how is this chapter related to the chapters that follow?
Well, I think everything that follows is either trying to help us better understand our changing context and some steps we can make. So more importantly, it's what could we do to get our congregation ready for this kind of world and to make the kind of decisions we need to make related to mission, vision, values in this congregation, and how to equip people for it, how to mentor people for that. So the rest of the book is just basically trying to help us come to grips with this context and make a plan.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you and Kevin for writing the book. It's available wherever good books are sold. And thank you, my brother and cousin in Jesus. It's always a joy talking with you.
Thank you, Rhett.
God bless you all for listening.
Listening and leading in a world we've never known is not an easy task for any Christian leader, but it's well worth the effort. We pray that this podcast will bless you richly. For more information and other resources, please visit lfmconnect.org. Again, that's lfmconnect.org. God bless you.